Welcome. I'm delighted to gavel in this first hearing and briefing of the Oversight Investigations Subcommittee. Today's event is entitled Update on Detainee Transfers from Guantanamo. Before we proceed with the hearing, I would like to emphasize how honored I am to serve as Oversight Investigations Subcommittee Chairwoman in this Congress. This subcommittee undertakes important work for the Committee of Armed Services. It strives to ensure that the policies and programs of the Department of Defense are properly formulated and implemented in the most efficient manner. Previous Congresses have recognized the critical role of standalone oversight and investigations. In fact, it is essential I recognize a former HASC chairman and my predecessor, the late Ike Skelton, who insisted on establishing this subcommittee when he became chairman of the Armed Services Committee during the 110th Congress. I'm also pleased to acknowledge that Chairman Joe Heck, who preceded me in this position last year, returns to the subcommittee as a sitting member, and I look forward to his continued involvement and insights. And I also look forward to working with Ranking Member Spear, as well as Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and all members of the subcommittee in the 114th Congress. So before continuing with my open remarks for the hearing, I'd like to recognize my colleague and ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Jackie Spear, for any welcoming remarks that she may wish to offer.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I too am privileged to serve with you as ranking member of this committee. I really think that there is no higher calling for all of us as members of Congress than to do rigorous investigations and oversight, and I look forward to working with you and recognizing that together in a bipartisan fashion we can address very thorny issues that come before us and hopefully come up with construction solutions. I yield back.
Yes, thank you. So as we turn to the subject matter at hand, I would like to state up front that we will not tolerate any disturbances of these proceedings, including verbal disruptions, standing or holding of signs. Appreciate your cooperation in this matter. So this afternoon, we have two senior officials appointed by the Obama administration charged with the responsibility to oversee the closure of Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility. Our witnesses will provide testimony on their roles and the interagency process for transferring detainees from the detention facility to other countries. We will then adjourn to a classified setting where we will be joined by an official from the Defense Intelligence Agency, in addition to our two witnesses, who will elaborate further on the interagency transfer process. In light of the statements we are about to receive from the witnesses and the type of details which are primarily classified, I ask unanimous consent that members hold all questions for the witnesses until the classified briefing. Hearing no objections, so ordered. According to information from Joint Task Force Guantanamo, the military organization that operates the detention facility, their responsibility is to detain unprivileged enemy belligerents. The Joint Task Force material explains that the detention of unprivileged enemy belligerents in wartime is, quote, a matter of security and military necessity and has long been recognized as legitimate under international law. The Joint Task Force further notes that detainees provide the United States with important intelligence that helps prevent future attacks. General James Mattis, a retired commander of U.S. Central Command, echoed this in testimony on January 27th to the Senate Armed Services Committee. He called for consistency in our detention policy and argued for the need to hold belligerents until the end of the fighting so they could not harm others. Despite the dedication of the men and women who created and operate GTMO today, any real or imagined misstep or procedural lapse from a decade ago has been sensationalized by our terrorist enemies. We must not allow them to succeed in inventing a narrative about GTMO and using this narrative to lead the GTMO's abolition. Let me be clear. Terrorists bombed the USS Cole before the detention center at Guantanamo existed. Terrorists hijacked 3 airplanes and wrought havoc in the United States on September 11, 2001, before GTMO was created. The Taliban established their brutal regime in Afghanistan before GTMO was built. Indeed, it was because of the death and destruction caused by these terrorists that GTMO came into being. The crazed fanatics who comprise the Islamic State do not exist because of GTMO. Certainly it's not true that if the facility ceased to exist, these brutal murders would renounce their violent ideology. It is wrong to suggest that because the Islamic State dresses their victims in orange jumpsuits, The United States bears even an incidental responsibility for the Islamic State's barbaric actions. It is also wrong to use this as a justification to shutter GTMO. Indeed, recent events should suggest greater, not lesser, caution in moving detainees out of GTMO. Yet, based on information provided by the Department of Defense, 33 detainees have been transferred from Guantanamo in the past 11 months, including 15 transfers just this past December alone. What is also shocking is that of the 33 transferred in the past 11 months, 7 of these detainees were among 48 recommended for continued detention by the Obama administration. 5 of those 7 detainees were the senior-most Taliban leaders sent to Qatar in May 2014. Recent news reports have suggested that the intelligence community believes one of these individuals may have returned to the fight. In our classified session, we are going to receive a briefing on the Taliban 5 and learn what the United States government currently assesses about them. 2 other detainees recommended for continued detention by the administration were transferred to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia in recent months. I expect to learn more about the process that resulted in the transfer of the 7 GTMO detainees that the President's own advisors recommended remain behind bars. Because the administration has often ignored recommendations yielded internally from the system it established, it seems hypocritical to malign legislation that seeks to improve and make more sound the transfer recommendation process. Furthermore, of those 15 detainees transferred in December, 4 were sent to Afghanistan, where, of course, the war still rages and U.S. forces are deployed, despite the administration's claim that combat operations have ceased. 6 other detainees were sent to Uruguay, where, according to press reports, the Uruguayan defense minister described them as, quote, totally free men who will not be restricted in any way, unquote. I look forward to today to learning if there's any basis for these reports, which, if true, are deeply disturbing. The remaining 26 of the 33 detainees transferred over the past 11 months were deemed to be transferable by the Presidential Task Force, but the task force noted nonetheless that a decision to approve a detainee for transfer does not equate to a judgment that the government lacked authority to hold the detainee. Even with this stated authority, the detainees were sent out of GTMO. I'm also eager to learn about the transfer arrangements for the detainees that fell into this category. This subcommittee, like the full Committee on Armed Services, will continue to vigorously oversee these and related issues. I look forward to the opportunity to mark up the legislation sponsored by Representative Walorski and co-sponsored by Representative Scott. I now turn to the ranking member for her opening remarks for today's hearings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for addressing this important topic. I also wish to thank our witnesses for appearing here this afternoon and for sharing with us their insights and their expertise. Madam Chairwoman, it's a long past time for the United States government to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. Its continuing operation damages national security by justifying abhorrent extremist behavior, by undermining relationships with allies and partners around the globe, and by wasting valuable national resources that could be put to productive use. Whether we like it or not, the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay is an injurious symbol. Whether a fair representation or not to many in the world, Guantanamo symbolizes a manifestation of lawless abuse. It is an emblem that fuels twisted ideological propaganda, and it is an effective tool in the corruption and recruitment of individuals by organizations that exist to do innocent people grave harm. Al-Qaeda, in its various forms, has long been considered Guantanamo a useful totem, but we would need to look no further than the recent atrocities that have been brutally committed and luridly disseminated by the so-called Islamic State for proof of Guantanamo's enduring liability. The Islamic State has purposely utilized imagery that evokes common conceptions of Guantanamo, such as cages and captives garbed in orange jumpsuits, in an effort to make its jihadist message resonate among those susceptible individuals who might be outraged by such references and persuaded to convert their anger into violence. Even Al-Qaeda's own English-language magazine, Inspire, uses those detained at Guantanamo as a rallying cry. Madam Chairwoman, for these reasons, we need to treat the closure of the detention facility at Guantanamo as a national security imperative. The breadth and depth of opposition to Guantanamo cannot be overstated. President Barack Obama and President George W. Bush, Secretary Hagel, Secretary Panetta, Secretary Gates, Generals Dempsey and Petraeus, and Admiral Mullen all similarly support the cessation of detention operations at Guantanamo. These are seasoned leaders, and we should respect their views, which are based on extensive experience in weighing and balancing competing national security risks. I also have here a letter, Madam Chair, written to Senators McCain and Reed by 42 retired flag and generals in the U.S. military. And I just want to read one or two sentences from their letter. It is hard to overstate how damaging the continued existence of the detention facility at Guantanamo has been and continues to be. It is a critical national security issue. Many of us have been told on repeated occasions by our friends in countries around the world that the greatest single action the United States can take to fight terrorism is to close Guantanamo. Responsibly managed, and I would like to have this submitted for the record.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Responsibly managed transfers of select individuals from Guantanamo into the custody of foreign countries constitutes the necessary first steps towards closing the detention center there and to embracing a more pragmatic detention policy which strengthens national security and upholds American values. As it stands, only 122 detainees remain under lock and key at Guantanamo, and 54 of those individuals are currently deemed eligible for transfer to another country because they've been put through a rigorous interagency review process, and it has been determined that the risk of their returning to the fight can be mitigated. We need to put more confidence in this process. Although one may never be complete in eliminating the risk that a transferred individual will re-engage, the risk can be managed. In fact, the re-engagement figures associated with the review process are down dramatically. According to the intelligence community, of the 88 transfers that occurred after January 2009, 6.8% of the transferred individuals are confirmed to have re-engaged, and one is suspected of having re-engaged. Contrast those figures with the 19% confirmed and 14.3% suspected of re-engagement among the 532 transfers that took place prior to 2009, that are over 30%. To me, the risk of re-engagement is outweighed by the risk that Guantanamo stigma will foment violent activities perpetrated by extremist individuals and organizations. Congress needs to help the President develop a more rational detention policy that bolsters national security and that is true to our values. The detention facility at Guantanamo is an obstacle that needs to be surmounted. We need to accelerate the process of responsibly transferring the detainees that we can off the island. Thank you again, Madam Chairwoman. Although the detainee transfer issue is one that has proven divisive and one that will continue to spark vigorous debate, it's an issue on which we must stay informed and in which we should facilitate progress. I look forward to a very frank and purposeful discussion in closed session, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Sure. Thank you. We're honored to have with us the full committee chairman. So welcome, Chairman Thornberry. And do you have any opening remarks that you'd like to make?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just say I appreciate you and the ranking member having this hearing. I completely agree with the statement that rigorous oversight is a key component of what Congress and this committee needs to do, and I would add rigorous and fair oversight needs to be a part of what a big part, and I think this subcommittee is going to have its plate full. On the subject of today's hearing, I just say I recognize there are differences of opinion about Guantanamo. I would caution members not to fall too easily for the propaganda of the terrorist organizations. I believe they will look for an excuse to justify their behavior, whether it's Guantanamo, whether it is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or anything else that they can get some traction on. While there are differences on Guantanamo, I hope there are no differences on the point that we do not want to see additional prisoners released who return to the battlefield to threaten Americans here or abroad. And I note I saw a press article just this morning that a gentleman who was released from Guantanamo back in 2007 or so was recently killed in, I believe, Afghanistan as a key facilitator for ISIS, even in Afghanistan. So while we have differences related to these issues, I hope that we can ensure that there are no further releases that pose dangers to us and our troops. And with that, I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also joining us today is the ranking member of the full committee, Ranking Member Smith. Do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I just quickly, I think it's a very important issue. I think it's very appropriate to have the hearing on it. I think, part of the issue with closing Guantanamo is, then I agree with the chairman, actually. I think that ISIS and Al-Qaeda will come up with whatever excuse they want to come up with. But the other issue that we have to deal with Guantanamo is not just what ISIS or Al-Qaeda thinks of it, but what some of our allies think of it. Critical to our ability to round up some terrorists throughout the world has been our close working relationship with a lot of our European allies and others, all of whom continue to be troubled by the presence of Guantanamo. So, will they cooperate with us if they think the possibility of that cooperation will lead to an inmate being sent to Guantanamo? Maybe yes, maybe no, but I think that is a problem. It is still an eyesore that goes beyond our enemies, who, as the chairman correctly points out, will find any number of different reasons to strike out at us. And I will also agree that we need a vigorous oversight. We need to, make sure, of who is really eligible for release and who isn't. But I think the track record that Ms. Spear, outlined shows that we have learned the lessons from the pre-2009 days, and we are doing a much, much better job of keeping careful track of who can be released and who can't be released, and that's been reflected in the statistics. There's never a 100% guarantee, but the track record has definitely improved. And lastly, I would say that, in order to close Guantanamo, you don't have to release all of the prisoners. That has never been the position, or my position anyway, in terms of what we should do in terms of closing Guantanamo. It's just that the presence of the prison continues to be an international eyesore, as I mentioned, to our allies, much more importantly than to our enemies. And second, we have the capability in the United States of America to house some of the most dangerous people in the world. We have well over 300 terrorists that are in U.S. federal prisons. It's always been, just a total straw man, bogus argument that's been set up. Oh, we can't bring these people here because they're dangerous. Well, regrettably, every society has to figure out a rational way and a safe way to deal with very dangerous people. And if we, as a society here in the United States, cannot safely hold dangerous people, then we're in a heck of a lot of trouble, whether Guantanamo exists or not. Whatever the population is, and I think the population's down to what, Mr. Lewis, sorry, it's about 122, yeah.
122.
So, whatever percentage of that population, and again, forget the numbers, but it's about half of that, I think, that have been deemed unreleasable for the time being, or that we don't want to release them. There's no reason on earth that they can't be safely housed here in the U.S., as we already have, with hundreds of terrorists. So we can get rid of an international eyesore, adequately protect ourselves, and I think move forward in a positive direction. And let us not forget that I don't think in the history of the world there has been a more expensive prison than Guantanamo. I'm going to get the number off here again, but it's somewhere, well, that's why Jackie says. She gives me all the numbers. She's got the sheet in front of her. It was like $3 million per inmate per year to hold them in Guantanamo, as compared with somewhere in the neighborhood of $75,000 to $80,000 a year for maximum security here in the U.S. And it simply doesn't make any policy sense to keep Guantanamo open. Part of that policy is sensibly figuring out who can be released and who can't be, but the other part of that policy is closing the prison and safely holding those who we need to continue to hold here in the United States. And with that, I thank the chairwoman for her indulgence, her time, and the hearing, and yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. So I'd now like to introduce our hearing witnesses. Paul Lewis was appointed in December 2013 by Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel to be the Department of Defense Special Envoy for closing the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Special Envoy Lewis received his undergraduate degree in history from the University of Notre Dame. After his graduation from Notre Dame Law School, he served in a variety of positions, including as a judge advocate in the United States Marine Corps. Before assuming his current responsibilities, Mr. Lewis held other positions in the Department of Defense and in the House of Representatives, and most significantly, prior to assuming his current position, he served in general counsel role for this committee. His responsibilities included, in particular, the activities of this subcommittee. Mr. Lewis, welcome back to the Armed Services Committee. Charles Trumbull is the acting special envoy for Guantanamo closure at the Department of State after having served as the deputy special envoy since 2013. His prior assignments include working in the Office of the Legal Advisor at the Department of State, where he focused on both international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Mr. Trumbull received his undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College and his law degree from Vanderbilt Law School. So welcome, Mr. Trumbull. So we will now turn to Mr. Lewis for your opening statement.
Thank you, ma'am. Madam Chairwoman, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Spear, distinguished members of the subcommittee and committee, and former colleagues on your dedicated staff. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on past and prospective transfers from the detention center at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague from the Department of State, Charlie Trumbull. I understand the members of the subcommittee will be participating in an oversight visit to the detention facility later this month, and I hope to join you on that visit. When you visit Guantanamo Bay, you'll see dedicated and professional service members who perform superbly under challenging and difficult conditions. I'd like to briefly summarize my written statement. On January 22, 2009, President Obama signed Executive Order 13492, which ordered the closure of the detention facilities at GTMO. Pursuant to this order, a special task force, the EOTF Task Force, was established to comprehensively review information in the possession of the U.S. government about the detainees and to assess appropriate disposition options. Since then, pursuant to another executive order signed by the President in 2011 and consistent with Section 1023 of the NDAA for fiscal year 2012, a periodic review board has begun to review the status of those detainees not currently eligible for transfer and for whom there are no charges pending and no judgment of conviction has been entered. As noted, there are 122 detainees remaining at the detention facility. Of these, 54 are eligible for transfer, 10 are being prosecuted or have been sentenced, and 58 are in the process of being reviewed by the PRB. Secretary of Defense Hagel, as noted, has approved the transfer of 44 detainees during his term as Secretary, 11 in 2013, 28 last year, and 5 this year. The great majority of these transfers occurred in accordance with the authorities in Section 1035 of the FY14 NDAA. I urge you to maintain those authorities. Madam Chairwoman, and members of the subcommittee, at the outset, I want to make one fundamental point about the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, which has been mentioned by several of you. The President has determined that closing this facility is a national security imperative. The President and his national security team have concluded that the continued operation of the facility weakens our national security by draining resources, damaging our relationships with key allies, and emboldening violent extremists. I believe it is no coincidence that the ISIL videos displaying barbaric and savage executions of American hostages, and most recently of a Jordanian pilot and a Japanese hostage, each showed the victim clothed in an orange jumpsuit, believed by many to be the symbol of the United States government's operation of the Guantanamo detention facility. ISIL and other terrorist groups exploit Guantanamo to enhance their propaganda and recruiting. As noted, 42 military leaders, all retired general officers and flag officers have addressed this issue. As stated, they said it's hard to overstate how damaging the continued existence of the detention facility at Guantanamo has been and continues to be. It is a critical national security issue, as mentioned by the ranking member. And as she emphasized, the letter continued, many of us have been told on repeated occasions by our friends in countries around the world that the greatest single action the United States can do to fight terrorism is to close Guantanamo. This letter was signed by General Charles C. Krulak, a retired commandant of the United States Marine Corps, Major General Michael Leonard, the first commanding general of the Detention Task Force at GTMO, General Joseph Hoare, the former head of CENTCOM, General David M. Maddox, the former head of the United States Army in Europe, and 36 other retired senior military leaders. Many other senior military leaders acknowledged the need to close the detention facility at GTMO as well. As noted, Admiral Michael Mullen and General Martin Dempsey, the current and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, support GTMO closure. In 2010, General David Petraeus, who was then the commander of CENTCOM, stated, "I've been on the record that for well over a year saying that GTMO should be closed, and I think that whenever we have perhaps taken expedient measures, they have turned around and bitten us. Abu Ghraib and other situations like that are non-biodegradables. They don't go away. The enemy continues to beat you with them like a stick." In addition to the military, senior figures across the political spectrum have made clear that Guantanamo poses profound risks to our national security and should be closed. As indicated to you, former Secretaries of State of Defense Robert Gates and Leon Panetta and the current Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel all support GTMO closure. And finally, as indicated, President George W. Bush himself concluded that the Guantanamo detention facility is, quote, "a propaganda tool for our enemies and a distraction for our allies." As noted, we've had 28 detainees transferred in 2014. 5 have been transferred this year. These detainees were transferred to 11 different countries. These recent transfers included repatriations to Algeria, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan, and the recent transfers also included resettlements to Qatar, Slovakia, Georgia, Uruguay, Kazakhstan, Estonia, and Oman. I look forward to discussing the details of each of these transfers and potential additional transfers in the closed briefing. Overall, 22 nations have taken detainees from GTMO who are not from that country. This broad support in the international community is also demonstrated by the numerous international organizations calling for closure, including the Organization for American States and most recently, the Vatican. As with our military leaders, foreign leaders regularly cite the Guantanamo Detention Center as an obstacle to counterterrorism efforts. For example, a high-ranking security official from one of our staunchest allies in counterterrorism told Charlie's predecessor, Cliff Sloan, the greatest single action the United States can do to fight terrorism is to close Guantanamo. I'll talk briefly about the transfer process. My written statement discusses this process, security assurances, which include travel restrictions, monitoring, information sharing, and reintegration and rehabilitation programs, all important factors in mitigating the risk in detail. But in summary, we try to do 3 things. We assess the risks and balance the risks. Transfers are not risk-free, but neither is continued detention. Second, we evaluate all source information in making these decisions, all source information. And 3, we tailor agreements and conditions to mitigate the threat, and we follow up. As indicated, we take the responsibility of re-engagement very seriously. Secretary Hagel has testified forcefully before the full committee on this. Briefly, the ODNI recognizes these figures in 3 ways: total, pre-January 22nd, 2009, and post-January 22nd of 2009. I'll summarize the current public reporting. For the total figures, they're 17.3% confirmed and 12.4% suspected, for a total of 29% confirmed or suspected of re-engagement. Prior to January 22nd, 2009, 19% confirmed, 14.3% suspected, for a total of 33%. And post-January 22nd, 2009, 6.8% confirmed and 1.1% suspected, for a total of 7.9% confirmed or suspected. In other words, as noted, the rate of re-engagement has been much lower for those transferred since 2009. Of the detainees transferred under this administration, over 90% are neither confirmed nor suspected of having re-engaged. And I want to emphasize one additional key point about this re-engagement data. Of the 107 confirmed of re-engaging, the vast majority of them transferred prior to 2009. 48 are either dead or in custody. Detainees transferred from GTMO by no means receive a free pass to re-engage. Their activities are closely watched, and we are committed to using all lawful tools, if necessary, to mitigate the threat such detainees may pose if they do re-engage. Finally, our plan to close the Guantanamo detention facility has three main elements. First, we'll continue the process of responsibly transferring the 54 detainees eligible for transfer. Second, we'll continue the prosecution of detainees in military commissions and, if possible, in federal courts. And third, we'll continue to expedite the PRB process. When we've concluded all these three lines of effort, it's likely that there'll be a limited number of detainees who cannot be prosecuted, but, as noted, are too dangerous to transfer, even with the security assurances. They will remain in our custody, and we will work with Congress on options for those detainees. In conclusion, President Bush worked towards closing GTMO, and many officials in his administration worked hard towards that objective. The President and his national security experts of this administration also believe it should be closed. The senior military leaders of the country and the leaders of the Department of Defense concur. As indicated in the letter by the retired military leaders, many believe closure of this facility is the single most important counterterrorism effort the United States can undertake. And as you've heard, many of our allies agree. We believe the issue is not whether to close the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. The issue is how to do it. And thank you, and I look forward to your questions at the closed briefing.
Thank you. Now we'll hear opening remarks from Mr. Trumbull.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Spear, and members of this committee. I appreciate your invitation to appear here today on the important matter of detainee transfers from Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility. I'm also honored to be here along with my colleague, Department of Defense Special Envoy Paul Lewis. The Special Envoy for Guantanamo closure serves as the State Department's lead negotiator for the transfer of Guantanamo detainees abroad, and my office has the primary responsibility for managing the diplomatic issues related to the facility. My office also plays a leading role in the interagency process that determines when and where a detainee is transferred, as well as the periodic review process for those detainees not currently approved for transfer. In addition, we work closely with our embassies around the world to follow up on the progress of detainees who have been transferred to other countries. It has been an honor to contribute to this administration's goal of closing the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, a process that started under the Bush administration. As President Obama has stated, the detention facility at Guantanamo, quote, weakens our national security by draining resources, damaging our relationships with key allies and partners, and emboldening violent extremists, end quote. World leaders consistently call on us to finally close Guantanamo, including Pope Francis just last month. From a foreign affairs perspective, I cannot overstate the fact that Guantanamo is a serious irritant in our relationships with important partners and allies, and interferes with our cooperation on issues ranging from security and counterterrorism to the promotion of human rights. As the acting special envoy, my and Paul's primary focus is to transfer the 54 detainees who are currently approved for transfer. Now, approved for transfer is an extremely important designation because it reflects the considered, unanimous judgment of national security experts from 6 agencies that an individual detainee can and should be transferred subject to appropriate security measures. That is, a detainee is approved for transfer only when defense, diplomatic, intelligence, and law enforcement professionals determine that the detainee's transfer is consistent with U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. Detainees can be approved for transfer in one of 2 ways. The vast majority of the 54 individuals currently approved for transfer were approved by the 2009 Executive Order Task Force, which included representatives from the Departments of State, the Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. This rigorous interagency process collected and considered all reasonably available information concerning the detainees at Guantanamo Bay. The decision to approve a detainee for transfer required the unanimous consensus of these 6 departments and agencies, and it reflected the best predictive judgment of senior government officials that any threat posed by the detainee could be sufficiently mitigated through feasible and appropriate security measures in the receiving country. As the publicly available task force report notes, many of these detainees were at most low-level fighters and are, quote, appropriate candidates for transfer from a threat perspective in light of their limited skills, minor organizational roles, or other factors, end quote. A detainee can also be approved for transfer by the Periodic Review Board. The PRB is in the process of considering detainees who are not currently approved for transfer, facing charges in the military commission, or awaiting or serving their military commission sentence. The PRB panel consists of 1 voting member from the Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, Justice, and State, as well as the Joint Staff and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The PRB's mandate is to determine whether the continued detention of a detainee is necessary to protect against a continuing significant threat to the national security of the United States. Detainees appearing before the PRB are assigned a personal representative and have the opportunity to be represented by a private counsel at no cost to the government. Detainees can provide an oral and a written statement, submit evidence, call witnesses, and elect to answer questions posed by the board members. Thus far, the PRB has reviewed the cases of 12 individuals and has reached a final determination in 9 of those cases. Of the 9 detainees whose results have been finalized, 6 were approved for transfer and 3 were designated for continued detention. This track record should make clear that the PRB is not a rubber stamp for either transfer or continued detention. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the detainee transfers that Paul has also gone over. We have made significant progress in transferring those detainees who are approved for transfer. As Paul noted, 28 detainees were transferred in 2014, and 5 detainees have been resettled thus far this year. The 54 remaining detainees who are approved for transfer can and should be transferred from Guantanamo, subject to appropriate security measures and humane treatment assurances. It is important to note that the decision to approve a detainee for transfer is not the end of the process. Prior to any transfer, the intelligence community provides an updated assessment of the individual, as well as an assessment of the receiving country's capabilities. We also work extensively with receiving governments to ensure that measures have been or will be taken to substantially mitigate the threat that the individual will engage or re-engage in activity that threatens the United States or United States persons or interests. Our rigorous approach to transfers, which looks both at the potential threat posed by the individual and the measures that the receiving country has taken or will take, is effective. According to the most recent public report from ODNI, of the detainees transferred under this administration, only 6.8% are confirmed, and only 1.1% are suspected of engaging in hostile or insurgent activity. While we take every instance of re-engagement very seriously, the important point is that over 90% of these individuals are not even suspected, much less confirmed, of engaging in hostile activities after their release. Now, one challenge we face in our effort to close Guantanamo is the fact that many of the detainees approved for transfer cannot be returned to their home country due to the security or humane treatment concerns. As former Special Envoy Sloan wrote in the New York Times, these individuals are not the worst of the worst, but rather the detainees at Guantanamo with the worst luck. Of the 54 detainees currently approved for transfer, 47, for example, are from Yemen. Members of this committee are certainly aware of the security situation in that country. This administration has not transferred a Guantanamo detainee to Yemen since 2010, and our current focus is resettling those individuals in third countries. In the past several months, we have resettled 12 Yemenis to 5 different countries. It is a testament to our strong standing internationally that numerous countries have been willing to provide homes for those individuals who cannot be returned to their home country and who should not remain at Guantanamo solely because of the security situation in Yemen. These countries should be commended for taking this important humanitarian step and for their contribution to the President's goal of closing Guantanamo in a secure and responsible manner. Looking forward, our goals for 2015 are clear. First, we must transfer all of those detainees approved for transfer, the vast majority of whom have been approved for 5 years. Second, we must continue and expedite the PRB process. In both of these efforts, I look forward to working closely with Paul Lewis and with my interagency colleagues, as well as members of this committee. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Pursuant to our unanimous consent agreement, we will now adjourn from open session and reconvene immediately for our classified briefing in room 2216.